The Emancipation Proclamation did not free every enslaved person in the United States on the day it was issued, and that is exactly why its power is so often misunderstood. That is the tension at the heart of the document. It was not a universal abolition law. It did not reach slavery everywhere the American flag still flew. It contained exemptions. It depended on armies. It named places where its promise would apply, and places where, for the moment, it would not. And yet, with those limits written directly into its legal structure, it changed the Civil War. On January 1st, 1863, in the city of Washington, President Abraham Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation. It was a wartime order, grounded in his authority as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States during an armed rebellion. It declared that enslaved people in designated areas still in rebellion against the United States were free. It also stated that the executive government of the United States, including its military and naval authorities, would recognize and maintain that freedom. Those words mattered because they turned policy into machinery. The proclamation did not simply announce an ideal. It instructed the Union war effort to treat freedom as something to be protected by federal power. Wherever Union military authority could reach within the named rebellious territory, the promise on paper could begin to take force on the ground. That is why the proclamation's limits are not a footnote to the story. They are part of the story itself. The order named Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia, but it also identified exempted areas. It did not apply to the loyal border states, where slavery still existed, but where the state governments had not joined the Confederacy. It also did not apply to certain parts of Confederate states already under Union control. The proclamation was powerful, but it was not total. It was sweeping, but it was not everywhere. It was moral in consequence, but military in mechanism. That combination has made the Emancipation Proclamation one of the most argued over documents in American history. To some, its exclusions make it seem cautious, compromised, even frustratingly narrow. To others, its legal design reveals its force. Lincoln was using the war powers he believed he possessed in rebellion, striking at slavery where it supported the Confederate war effort, and placing the authority of the United States behind the freedom of people the order declared free. The phrase "one page of ink" captures the drama, but not the literal object. The official government copy preserved by the National Archives is 5 pages. It was originally tied with narrow red and blue ribbons attached to the signature page by a wafered impression of the seal of the United States. Later, the Department of State marked it in red ink as Proclamation 95. Lincoln's original handwritten copy did not survive. It burned in the Chicago Fire of 1871. But the official signed government copy endured, passing from the Department of State to the National Archives in 1936. That surviving document is more than a relic. Its paper, ribbons, seal, and official markings remind us that emancipation was not only a battlefield process, or only a moral demand, or only the self-liberating action of enslaved people moving toward Union lines. It was also an act of government, written in the formal language of state power, issued from Washington while the war still raged. But the day it was signed was not the day the idea began. By January 1st, 1863, Lincoln had been moving toward this step for months. An early version of the policy had been read to his cabinet on July 22, 1862. That early draft was connected to the Second Confiscation Act, which had been approved on July 17th. The legal and political logic was already taking shape before the public announcement came. Lincoln was not improvising on New Year's Day. He was bringing into force a policy that had passed through law, cabinet discussion, military calculation, and battlefield timing. The timing is essential. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation had been issued on September 22, 1862, 5 days after the Battle of Antietam. That battle, fought near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek, came after General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia moved into the North for the first time. Major General George B. McClellan and the Army of the Potomac confronted them there on September 17th. The National Park Service describes Antietam as the single bloodiest day in United States history, with about 23,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing after about 12 hours of combat. The human cost was staggering. But in the political logic of the war, Antietam created an opening. Lee's army retreated back into Virginia on the night of September 18th, ending that first invasion of the North. Secretary of State William H. Seward had advised Lincoln to wait for a major Union military success before making emancipation public. If announced after a string of setbacks, the policy might look like desperation. After Antietam, costly and incomplete as the result was, Lincoln had the moment he needed. So the final proclamation of January 1st cannot be understood by looking only at that winter day in Washington. It has to be followed backward, to the preliminary warning of September 22nd, to Antietam and its terrible arithmetic, to Seward's caution in the cabinet, to the July reading, and to the legal framework that allowed Lincoln to define emancipation as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing rebellion. It also has to be followed forward. The proclamation authorized black men of suitable condition to be received into the armed service of the United States, including service in forts, positions, stations, and vessels. That provision changed the relationship between black Americans and the Union war effort. Enslaved and free black men were not only people affected by federal policy, they could become armed participants in the destruction of slavery. The United States colored troops were first recruited in 1863 and eventually included 175 regiments, according to the National Park Service. By the end of the Civil War, almost 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union and freedom, according to the National Archives. That transformation was not instant everywhere. The proclamation's promise moved with military power, with self-emancipation, with enlistment, with federal enforcement, and with continued political struggle. In Texas, enforcement came late. The Smithsonian notes that freedom was announced in Galveston Bay on June 19, 1865, when Union troops arrived there. The long distance between Washington in January and Galveston Bay, more than 2 years later, shows why emancipation was not a single moment that fell evenly across the nation. It was a process, uneven and contested, carried by war. Still, the turn on January 1st was real. Before the proclamation, the Union war effort was not publicly defined as a war to abolish slavery everywhere. After it, the preservation of the Union became officially bound to emancipation in rebel-held territory. The war's meaning changed, and so did its machinery. Union advance now carried a declared policy of freedom. Confederate slavery, as a labor system supporting rebellion, became a direct military target. Foreign support for the Confederacy became more politically difficult, especially in places such as Britain and France, where anti-slavery opinion mattered. That is the central contradiction. A limited document helped produce an expansive change. A proclamation with exemptions became a turning point. A legal order dependent on armies became a moral landmark. A government copy of 5 pages, tied with ribbons and sealed by official authority, helped redirect the largest conflict in American history. To see how that happened, we have to begin before the ink dried, before the cabinet debates, before Antietam gave Lincoln his opening. We have to return to a country already at war, where the Union's public purpose was still being defined, and where the question of slavery pressed harder with every mile the armies moved. Before the ink dried, before the cabinet heard Lincoln's early draft, the war already had its own momentum. Armies were moving. Families were divided. The United States government was fighting an armed rebellion, and the Union's declared public purpose had not yet become the broad promise many would later associate with the Emancipation Proclamation. That distinction matters. When the final proclamation appeared in the city of Washington on January 1, 1863, it did not emerge into an empty political space. It entered a war already filled with competing pressures: military necessity, constitutional limits, enslaved people seeking freedom, loyal slave states still inside the Union, and a Confederacy whose war effort depended in part on slavery as a labor system. Lincoln's policy took shape inside that pressure. It was not simply a speech about values. It was a wartime instrument built for a specific conflict against specific territory under a specific claim of presidential authority. Before that instrument existed, the Union war effort was publicly framed most plainly around preservation of the Union. The federal government was fighting to suppress rebellion and restore national authority. That purpose was enormous on its own. It asked soldiers to march, fight, and die for the survival of the United States as a single country. But it did not, at the beginning, mean that the government had publicly committed itself to emancipation everywhere slavery existed. This is one of the hardest parts of the story to hold clearly, because the Civil War and emancipation are now inseparable in American memory. The war became the road through which slavery was destroyed. But the official purpose of the Union war effort did not begin with a nationwide abolition order. The Emancipation Proclamation would later change the character of the war by making emancipation in rebel-held territory an explicit military, political, and moral objective. That change was not decorative. It altered what Union victory would mean. The limits of the proclamation help reveal the world before it. The final order did not apply to loyal border states. It also exempted parts of Confederate states already under Union control. These boundaries were not accidental. They reflected the legal and military logic Lincoln would use. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy during an armed rebellion, he claimed power to take action against areas still in rebellion. In other words, emancipation in the proclamation was tied to war power. It was aimed at the rebellion's territory and at the labor system that helped sustain the Confederate war effort. So, before the page, the country was not only at war over armies and borders. It was at war over what the war itself would become. On one side stood the Union government, trying to preserve the United States and suppress an armed rebellion. On the other stood the Confederate States, fighting to establish and defend their separation. Between the lines, in camps, towns, plantations, and occupied regions, slavery pressed itself into the conflict whether politicians wished to move quickly or not. Enslaved people were not an abstract issue waiting politely for legislation. Their labor mattered to the Confederate war effort. Their flight toward Union lines created practical questions for commanders. Their future became inseparable from the movement of armies. The proclamation's later language would make that connection official. It stated that the executive government of the United States, including military and naval authorities, would recognize and maintain the freedom of the people it declared free. That phrase, recognize and maintain, is quiet on the page, but it carries the machinery of war inside it. It meant that Union power would not merely announce freedom in designated places. It would be expected to uphold it as armies and naval forces entered or controlled those places. This was the transformation. The Union Army and Navy became instruments through which the policy could become real on the ground. A battlefield advance was no longer only a movement of troops across a map. In areas covered by the proclamation, it could become a movement of federal authority into the defense of freedom. But that transformation had not yet been made public as official policy. Before the proclamation, the question remained unresolved at the highest level. Could the war to preserve the Union become a war that also struck directly at slavery, where rebellion still held power? Lincoln's eventual answer would not be a simple universal declaration. It would be a carefully bounded wartime act. It would name states in rebellion. It would identify exempted places. It would distinguish between regions still outside federal control and regions already under Union occupation. It would leave slavery untouched in loyal border states. That limited structure has often been read as weakness, but in the wartime setting, it was also the source of the document's claimed authority. Lincoln was not presenting it as a general moral wish. He was presenting it as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing rebellion. The war setting also explains why Maryland mattered. Antietam would later be fought near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. Maryland was a slave state that remained in the Union. That fact alone captures the political complexity surrounding emancipation policy. The war was not simply divided between a free North and a slave South in a clean geographic line. Some slave states remained loyal to the Union. Some parts of Confederate states came under Union control before the Final Proclamation. Any federal emancipation policy had to move through that complicated landscape. For Lincoln, the challenge was not whether slavery was connected to the rebellion. The deeper problem was how, when, and under what authority the United States government could strike it. An emancipation order announced as a war measure had to be tied to the suppression of rebellion. It had to be timed so it did not appear to be a last, desperate gesture from a government losing the conflict. It had to persuade audiences at home, influence observers abroad, and give military commanders a policy they could actually enforce. That is why the proclamation eventually became more than a moral statement. It became a political signal and a military mechanism. It told the Confederacy that continued rebellion would bring a direct federal assault on slavery in the territories still resisting United States authority. It told enslaved people in those areas that the Union government had committed itself, at least on paper and through its forces, to recognizing and maintaining their freedom. It told foreign powers that the war had become openly linked to emancipation, making support for the Confederacy more difficult in places where anti-slavery opinion mattered, especially Britain and France. But all of that lay ahead. Before the page, the Union still had to pass through a period of uncertainty. The government was already at war, but the meaning of that war was still being contested and expanded. The legal theory had to be shaped. The military timing had to be found. The political risk had to be weighed. Lincoln had to move from pressure and conviction toward a document that could survive as policy. By the middle of 1862, that movement was no longer only theoretical. Congress had acted with the Second Confiscation Act, approved on July 17, 1862. Within days, Lincoln would bring an early version of his emancipation policy before his cabinet. The war had not yet delivered the battlefield opening he needed, and the public had not yet seen the warning that would come after Antietam. But behind the doors of government in Washington, the page was beginning to take form. The page that was beginning to take form did not appear suddenly after a battle. It did not wait, fully unborn, for the smoke at Antietam Creek. By the time the Union found the military opening that would make a public announcement possible, Abraham Lincoln had already carried the idea into the highest room of Executive Council. The policy was still private. It was still unfinished. But on July 22, 1862, in Washington, Lincoln first read an early version of his emancipation policy to his cabinet. That date matters because it places the origin of the proclamation's public life before the battlefield event most closely tied to it. Antietam would become the opening. Antietam would give Lincoln the moment to speak without seeming to speak from defeat. But the document itself was already being shaped in the pressure of law, war, and executive judgment during the summer of 1862. Only 5 days before that cabinet reading, on July 17th, Congress had approved the Second Confiscation Act. The act belonged to the expanding legal landscape of the war. It reflected a government trying to answer a problem the armies had already exposed. Slavery was not separate from the rebellion. It was part of the labor system that supported Confederate power. It was part of the structure the Union was fighting against, even if the Union had not yet made emancipation the central public meaning of the war. Lincoln's early draft was connected to that act. That connection does not mean the future proclamation was simply a congressional measure put into presidential language. It means the draft grew out of a moment when legal action and military necessity were beginning to converge. Congress had moved. The president was considering how his own wartime authority could be used. The question was no longer whether slavery was implicated in the conflict. The question was how far the federal government could move against it, under what authority, and at what time. Inside the cabinet, the early reading was therefore more than a preview of a document. It was a test of policy before it entered history. Lincoln was not yet issuing the final order. He was not yet making the public warning that would come on September 22nd. He was bringing the idea before the men who served at the center of the administration, where every sentence would have consequences beyond the page. The scene would later become one of the iconic images of the Civil War era. Francis Bicknell Carpenter painted the first reading before the cabinet in a work 15 feet wide, now in the Senate wing of the United States Capitol. The painting belongs to memory, but the meeting itself belongs to policy. It reminds us that emancipation was not only a battlefield result and not only a moral declaration. It was also a government decision, argued and timed inside the machinery of the state. That machinery mattered. The United States was fighting an armed rebellion. Lincoln would later ground the Final Proclamation in his authority as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. He would describe the action as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing that rebellion. The legal shape of the later document was already visible in the summer. It would not be framed as a general abolition law for the entire country. It would be framed as a wartime act against places still in rebellion. This was both its power and its limitation. A proclamation based on war powers could reach where the rebellion gave the president military grounds to act. It could be tied to the movement of armies and navies. It could transform Union military success into a mechanism for freedom. But it could not, by that same logic, simply abolish slavery everywhere under the Constitution. That larger national abolition would come only later, after the war, through the 13th Amendment. In July of 1862, Lincoln was working within a narrower but forceful wartime path. The Second Confiscation Act helped mark that path. It showed that Congress was willing to use the law against the foundations of rebellion, including the property claims of those supporting it. Lincoln's developing policy moved towards something still more direct, a declaration of freedom for enslaved people in states or parts of states that remained in rebellion after a specified warning. That warning would eventually be made public in the preliminary proclamation. But the seed of it was already present in the cabinet reading. There is a quiet drama in that sequence. On July 17th, Congress approved the Second Confiscation Act. On July 22nd, Lincoln read an early version of an emancipation policy to his cabinet. On September 17th, the armies would collide near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. On September 22nd, 5 days after that battle, Lincoln would issue the preliminary proclamation. On January 1st, 1863, in the city of Washington, he would issue the Final Proclamation. Seen in order, these dates reveal that Lincoln was not simply reacting to Antietam. He was waiting for a way to act. The policy had already been drafted before the military opportunity arrived. The battlefield did not create the idea. It created the conditions in which the idea could be announced. That distinction changes how we understand the proclamation. If Antietam alone explains it, the document can seem like a sudden turn made under pressure. But the July cabinet reading shows a different process. Lincoln was already linking emancipation to the suppression of rebellion. He was already moving toward a policy that would alter the Union war effort from within. The eventual order would not merely say that enslaved people in designated areas were free. It would require the executive government, including military and naval authorities, to recognize and maintain that freedom. That phrase would turn federal power into an instrument of enforcement. In July, however, that future was still uncertain. A policy can be written before it can be safely issued. A president can hold a document in his hand and still know that the moment is wrong. In the summer of 1862, the Union war effort had not yet produced the kind of unmistakable success that would make a sweeping emancipation announcement appear as an act of strength. The Confederacy was still fighting with force. The loyal border states still complicated every federal move against slavery. Foreign governments watched the conflict, and foreign public opinion mattered. The timing of the announcement could shape whether the measure was understood as confidence or desperation. That is why the cabinet reading stands at a hinge in the story. It was the moment when the policy became real inside the administration, but not yet real to the nation. The men in the room heard what the public would not hear for 2 more months. The page existed in draft, but it had not yet become a warning. It had direction, but it did not yet have its battlefield opening. Lincoln's position was delicate. If he moved too soon, the policy might seem like a last resort from a government unable to win by arms. If he waited too long, the war would continue without the full force of a clear emancipation objective. The document had to be both morally significant and strategically credible. It had to speak against slavery while functioning as a war measure. It had to satisfy the pressure of the moment without outrunning the authority on which it claimed to stand. The first cabinet reading did not resolve all of those tensions. It exposed them. It placed the proposed policy before advisors who understood the stakes differently, and among them, Secretary of State William H. Seward would offer the warning that shaped the next stage of the proclamation's journey. His concern was not simply whether emancipation should be announced. It was when. A measure intended to weaken the Confederacy and strengthen the Union had to be released from a position that looked like power. So the page waited. Not because it lacked meaning. Not because Lincoln had failed to decide that emancipation could become a weapon of war. It waited because in civil war, even ink needed an opening made by armies. The early draft had entered the cabinet room in July. Its public voice would depend on events still ahead, on a battlefield in Maryland, and on the careful judgment that a proclamation of freedom could not be allowed to sound like a cry of defeat. The early draft had entered the cabinet room in July, but it could not yet enter the country in the same way. A private decision, even one made by a president in wartime, was not the same as a public act. Once announced, the policy would belong not only to Lincoln and his advisors, but to soldiers in the field, enslaved people watching Union lines, Confederate leaders measuring threats to their labor system, and foreign governments deciding what kind of war the United States was now fighting. That was the weight behind William H. Seward's warning. Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, understood that the proposed proclamation would not be received in a quiet room. It would land in the middle of a war whose fortunes were uncertain, and its meaning would be shaped by the news around it. If the Union announced emancipation after military failure, the same words that Lincoln meant as an assertion of power could be read as evidence of weakness. A proclamation intended to show that the federal government could strike at the foundations of the rebellion might instead appear to be a last resort from an administration running out of options. That was the strategic problem. Timing could change the message. Lincoln had already brought the policy before the cabinet on July 22, 1862. The idea was not merely rhetorical. It was tied to the legal and military realities of the war, including the Second Confiscation Act, approved on July 17th. The United States was facing an armed rebellion, and the federal government was trying to define how far military necessity could reach into the social system that supported the Confederacy. Enslaved labor was not separate from the war. It sustained farms, transportation, fortifications, and the broader Confederate economy. To weaken slavery in rebel-held territory was to weaken part of the machinery behind the Confederate war effort. But a policy can be strong in design and still vulnerable in presentation. Seward's concern was that emancipation, announced at the wrong moment, might look less like command than panic. The proclamation would be a war measure. It would declare that, if rebellion continued, enslaved people in states or parts of states still in rebellion would be declared free. But if that message followed defeat, the public might hear something else. They might hear an administration trying to compensate for failure on the battlefield with a dramatic political gesture. They might hear desperation where Lincoln wanted firmness. In wartime, perception was not a decoration added after the fact. It was part of policy itself. The Confederacy was watching. Border states were watching. Union soldiers and officers were watching. Enslaved people and free black Americans were watching. So were Britain and France, where anti-slavery opinion mattered, and where any foreign support for the Confederacy carried political risk. A public turn toward emancipation would help define the Union cause in a new way. It would make the war harder to describe as a simple contest between two governments. It would attach the survival of the United States to a policy aimed directly at slavery in the rebellious areas. That diplomatic dimension belonged naturally to Seward's office. As Secretary of State, he was responsible for foreign relations, and he understood that the war was being interpreted beyond American borders. If the proclamation appeared to arise from defeat, foreign observers might see it as a sign that the Union was unstable, perhaps even grasping. But if it followed a major Union military success, it could look like what Lincoln needed it to be, the act of a government that still possessed the strength to enforce its will. This is why the waiting mattered. It was not a pause born of indifference. It was not a retreat from the moral and military force of the draft Lincoln had read. The delay was part of the document's path to power. The proclamation had to become public in a setting where it could command attention without seeming to beg for rescue. It had to be attached to momentum. The Union needed a battlefield result that could give the words a foundation. The irony is sharp. The document that would help transform the meaning of the war could not transform the war by appearing alone. Ink needed armies. A presidential order could change the purpose and machinery of the conflict, but only if the government issuing it could still show that it had the ability to fight, occupy, and enforce. The proclamation would later promise that the executive government, including military and naval authorities, would recognize and maintain the freedom of those it declared free. That phrase depended on more than language. It depended on Union power moving across territory. Seward saw the danger in separating the words from that power. A proclamation of emancipation in rebel-held territory would strike at the heart of the Confederacy's labor system. It would also invite resistance, criticism, and confusion. It did not abolish slavery throughout the entire United States. It would not reach loyal border states. It would operate where Lincoln claimed wartime authority over rebellious areas. Those limits made the timing even more important. Because the order was geographically limited and grounded in military necessity, It needed to be presented as a disciplined act of war policy, not as a symbolic cry thrown into the air after a setback. Lincoln, by waiting, allowed the policy to remain ready while the armies searched for the opening that politics required. This was one of the quieter turning points in the story of the Emancipation Proclamation. No battlefield smoke hangs over it. No casualty lists define it. It happened in the realm of judgment, when to speak, when to hold back, when to understand that a public document carries not only its text, but the circumstances of its release. Seward's advice did not erase Lincoln's decision. It shaped the moment when that decision could become public. There is a kind of discipline in that delay. Lincoln had already moved beyond the idea that the Union war effort could remain untouched by slavery. The policy was forming. The relationship between emancipation and military necessity had become real inside the government. Yet the country had not heard it yet, because the administration had to avoid letting the proclamation be dismissed as an act of weakness. That risk was not abstract. The summer of 1862 did not offer Lincoln the clear military triumph he needed. A proclamation issued into uncertainty could be swallowed by doubt. If the Union seemed to be losing control of the war, then a policy meant to disrupt the Confederacy might instead strengthen Confederate claims that the federal government was desperate and radicalized by failure. Supporters might be inspired, but opponents would have an opening. Foreign observers might hesitate. The message could fracture before it took hold. So the draft waited in the shadow between decision and announcement. That shadow reveals something essential about the document's eventual power. The Emancipation Proclamation was not simply a moral statement, though it carried enormous moral force. It was not simply a legal instrument, though Lincoln would ground it in his authority as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy during an armed rebellion. It was also a strategic act, timed to the movement of armies and the public meaning of victory. It had to be released when the Union could say, not merely that it intended to act, but that it remained capable of acting. Seward's warning, then, did not weaken the proclamation. It helped protect it. He understood that the first public presentation would matter for everything that followed. Once issued, the preliminary proclamation would create a deadline. It would warn that enslaved people in designated areas still in rebellion on January 1, 1863, would be declared free. That warning would have force because it came from a government still fighting to suppress the rebellion. But before that deadline could be announced, the Union needed the battlefield to offer a credible moment of strength. The question became where that moment would come from. It would not come from a cabinet table in Washington alone. It would not come from the legal language of the Second Confiscation Act alone. It would have to come from soldiers moving through real ground, from commanders making decisions under pressure, from the unpredictable violence of a campaign. The proclamation's public life depended on events beyond the White House. By September, those events began to gather in Maryland. General Robert E. Lee carried the Army of Northern Virginia into the North for the first time. Major General George B. McClellan and the Army of the Potomac moved to confront him. The place that would give Lincoln his opening was not a grand hall of government, but the countryside near Sharpsburg along Antietam Creek. There, the warning Seward had given in July would meet the war itself. The page was ready. What it still needed was a battlefield that could make its announcement sound like resolve. By September, the waiting had moved out of Washington and onto Maryland soil. The question that had sat inside the cabinet room in July now traveled with armies. Lincoln had a policy in hand, but Seward's warning still hung over it. A proclamation of emancipation, if released after defeat, might seem like a government reaching for any weapon because all others had failed. If released after a success, it could sound different. It could sound like a government using victory to define what the war would now mean. That is why the movement of General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland mattered beyond the immediate military campaign. Lee was not simply shifting troops across a map. He was carrying the war into the North for the first time. The Confederacy had survived the war's opening phases, and now its most important Eastern army crossed into a state that remained in the Union. Maryland made the moment especially charged. It was a slave state, but it had not left the United States. It bordered Washington, and its loyalty had direct military and political importance. A Confederate army on Maryland ground brought the rebellion close to the federal capital, close to the symbolic center of Union authority and close to a population whose position in the war could not be reduced to a simple line between North and South. The battlefield that emerged from this movement was near Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. It was rural ground, not the kind of place where governments usually announce the direction of history. Yet by the middle of September, this countryside became tied to the future of Lincoln's proclamation. The page waiting in Washington needed an event that could answer Seward's concern. It needed a Union military success large enough to make the announcement of emancipation appear as an act of command, not desperation. Major General George B. McClellan led the Army of the Potomac toward Lee. McClellan was the commander responsible for confronting the Confederate invasion on Union soil. Lee commanded the Army of Northern Virginia, the force whose movement into Maryland had created the crisis and the opportunity at once. The two armies moved toward one another in a campaign that would decide more than whether Lee could remain north of the Potomac. It would help decide whether Lincoln could move from private decision to public proclamation. In this sense, Antietam was already political before the first great shock of combat. Not political in the narrow sense of speeches or elections, but political because armies were shaping the conditions under which the federal government could act. Lincoln's draft had legal reasoning behind it. It drew from wartime authority and from the developing understanding that slavery in rebellious territory was not only a moral wrong, but also part of the Confederacy's labor system and war power. But legal reasoning alone could not solve the problem of timing. A commander-in-chief could write an order. He could not simply write the appearance of strength into existence. That appearance had to be made in the field. Lee's invasion created a decisive test. If the Army of Northern Virginia could operate successfully in Maryland, it would deepen doubts about the Union's ability to suppress the rebellion. It would suggest that the Confederacy could do more than defend its own territory. It could threaten Union ground directly. In that atmosphere, a sudden emancipation announcement might have seemed to confirm exactly what Seward feared, that the Union government, unable to master the battlefield, was turning to a dramatic policy because its military situation was failing. But if McClellan could stop Lee, the meaning changed. Even a hard and costly result could become the opening Lincoln needed if it ended the Confederate advance into the North. The difference lay not in triumphal certainty, but in public posture. The Union did not need a parade ground victory to announce a new war aim. It needed enough success to show that the government still possessed initiative. Along Antietam Creek, the landscape became part of the machinery of emancipation, though no one looking across the fields near Sharpsburg would have seen it that way in full. Soldiers did not march there as footnotes to a document. They marched under orders, in formations, under commanders trying to defeat an enemy army. Yet the outcome of their campaign would determine whether words already written could be released to the country. This is one of the quiet tensions at the center of the story. The Emancipation Proclamation is remembered as a document, as language, as an act of presidential authority. But its public birth depended on the instability of war. A policy developed in Washington had to wait on roads, rivers, camps, and fields. It had to wait on Lee's decision to enter Maryland. It had to wait on McClellan's ability to bring the Army of the Potomac against him. It had to wait on whether the Confederate invasion could be stopped. For Lincoln, the timing was not a small matter of public relations. It was part of the policy's force. The proclamation was meant to change the Union war effort by making emancipation in rebellious territory a military, political, and moral objective. That transformation required authority, but it also required credibility. If the Union appeared to be losing control of the war, the proclamation might be dismissed by enemies and doubted by friends. If issued in the aftermath of a checked invasion, it could stand as a warning backed by armies still in the field. This is why Antietam occupies such a central place in the path from the July cabinet reading to the September preliminary proclamation. The battle did not create Lincoln's decision from nothing. The policy had already taken shape. The cabinet had already heard it. Seward had already advised delay. What Antietam offered was not the idea of emancipation, but the moment when that idea could be spoken publicly with the force of wartime resolve. The stakes also extended beyond the United States. The proclamation would have diplomatic importance because it made foreign support for the Confederacy more politically difficult, especially in Britain and France, where anti-slavery opinion mattered. That fact sharpened the need for careful timing. A proclamation issued from weakness might not only fail at home, it could also fail abroad. Governments watching the war would measure not only the moral language of Union policy, but the strength of the Union position behind it. Lee's Maryland campaign therefore brought several pressures together. It threatened Union territory. It challenged the Army of the Potomac. It placed a slave state that remained in the Union at the center of military events. And it created the possibility that the federal government could answer a Confederate invasion with both military resistance and a new definition of the war. That possibility was not guaranteed. Nothing about the movement toward Sharpsburg promised a clean victory or a simple political result. The ground near Antietam Creek would not offer Lincoln an easy triumph. It would offer something narrower and more costly, a chance to say that the Confederate advance had been stopped and that the Union would now wage war with emancipation as an explicit instrument of suppressing rebellion. The page in Washington was ready, but it was not yet public. The president still had to wait for the outcome of fighting in Maryland. The armies had converged near Sharpsburg. Lee's first invasion of the North had forced the question into the open. McClellan and the Army of the Potomac stood between the Confederate Army and the larger consequences of its movement. On September 17, 1862, the waiting would turn into one of the most terrible days in American history. The political opening Lincoln needed would come not cleanly and not cheaply, but through hours of combat along Antietam Creek. The waiting ended not with a sentence, but with gunfire. On September 17, 1862, the fields and roads near Sharpsburg, Maryland, became the place where Lincoln's private decision and the Army's public violence met. The president was not on the battlefield. The paper was not there either. The draft that had been read in Washington remained part of a political calculation still hidden from the country. But along Antietam Creek, Major General George B. McClellan's Army of the Potomac and General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia were fighting over the very conditions Seward had warned Lincoln to wait for, a Union military success strong enough to carry the weight of emancipation. The National Park Service describes Antietam as the single bloodiest day in United States history. That phrase can become familiar from repetition, but it should not become small. It means that in about 12 hours of combat, about 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. Not over a campaign, not over a season, in one day. That number stood behind the opening Lincoln would use 5 days later. It was the human cost beneath the phrase military success. In Washington, strategy could be discussed in terms of timing, authority, and public effect. On Maryland soil, the same timing was paid for in bodies carried from the field, in units broken by fire, in families that would wait for names to appear on lists of the dead, the wounded, or the missing. Antietam mattered because it stopped Lee's first invasion of the North. But before it could matter in that larger sense, it had to be endured as a day of combat. The armies had come together near Sharpsburg because the Confederate movement into Maryland had forced a crisis. Lee had crossed into territory where the consequences of victory could reach far beyond the battlefield. McClellan's army stood in the way, and the Union government watched for an outcome that could be spoken of not as rescue from disaster, but as evidence that the rebellion could be met and checked. The battle's length is part of its meaning. About 12 hours is short enough to fit within a single turn of daylight. It is also long enough for violence to become a landscape. Morning, midday, and afternoon did not bring a clean decision, so much as repeated tests of endurance. Soldiers entered the day as members of organized armies, under commanders whose names would shape public memory. By its end, the casualty figures had become one of the defining facts of the Civil War. The word casualties can hide as much as it reveals. Killed, wounded, or missing are separate conditions, but together they measure disruption on a scale that no headquarters map can fully hold. A killed soldier left no uncertainty about the finality of the day. A wounded soldier might survive with pain, disability, or fear that the wound would still claim him later. A missing soldier left a different kind of wound behind, one made of absence and not knowing. At Antietam, about 23,000 men fell into those categories. For Lincoln, the outcome of the day would become politically usable. But that use did not make the battle clean, and it did not make the opening broad. This is one of the hard truths in the story of the Emancipation Proclamation. A document that would help transform the purpose of the war did not emerge from a moment of easy victory. It emerged after a day whose scale of suffering made clear how enormous the war had become. The proclamation had been forming before Antietam. Lincoln had already read an early version to his cabinet in July. Seward had already warned that the announcement should wait for a military success. Those earlier steps matter because they show that emancipation was not improvised out of the bloodshed at Sharpsburg. But Antietam supplied the public setting in which the decision could be released. It gave Lincoln the chance to act from a position that looked less like desperation and more like resolve. Still, the battlefield did not hand him triumph in a simple form. Antietam was not the kind of victory that erased doubt. It was a stopping point, a check on Lee's advance, a brutal interruption of Confederate momentum in the North. The Army of the Potomac had confronted the Army of Northern Virginia on Maryland soil and prevented the invasion from becoming something larger. That was enough for Lincoln's purpose, but it was enough only after one of the most devastating days in American history. This is why the National Park Service description carries such weight. To call Antietam the single bloodiest day in United States history is not only to rank it among battles. It is to remind us that the political opening for emancipation was created in the shadow of mass suffering. The page of ink that would follow was not written in a world separate from the battlefield. It depended on what the armies did and on what the armies lost. There is a temptation, when telling this story from the perspective of Washington, to make the battlefield serve the document too neatly. The cabinet meets. Seward gives advice. Lee enters Maryland. McClellan confronts him. Antietam happens. Lincoln issues the preliminary proclamation. The sequence is accurate, but too smooth if left alone. The men who fought on September 17th did not experience themselves as stepping stones in a legal and moral transformation. They experienced a day of fear, command, confusion, injury, and death. And yet, history often turns on events that mean more than those inside them can see. The soldiers near Antietam Creek were fighting within the military demands of the moment, but the result of their fighting changed what could be said in the name of the Union. It helped create the circumstances in which the preservation of the United States could be joined publicly to emancipation in rebel-held territory. That connection would not abolish slavery everywhere. It would not instantly free every enslaved person, but it would change the official direction of the war. The terrible cost of Antietam also revealed why the old language of the conflict was becoming insufficient. A war producing about 23,000 killed, wounded, or missing in a single day was no limited disturbance. It was a national catastrophe, demanding decisions equal to its scale. Lincoln's move toward emancipation did not come from battlefield horror alone, but the horror made the scale of the crisis unmistakable. The rebellion was not going to be suppressed by ordinary measures. The war was consuming men by the thousands, and the system of slavery remained bound to the Confederate war effort. To strike at that system as a military measure was becoming part of how the Union would fight. So Antietam stands in this story as both battlefield and threshold. On one side was the private draft, the cabinet discussion, the warning to wait. On the other side was the preliminary proclamation that would tell the rebellious states what would happen if they remained in rebellion on January 1st, 1863. Between those two stood September 17th, a day of about 12 hours and about 23,000 casualties, near a creek in Maryland. The meaning of that day did not settle when the firing stopped. Armies still had to move. Commanders still had to decide whether to hold, withdraw, pursue, or regroup. Lee's invasion had been checked, but the shape of the opportunity was still narrow and uncertain. The field had given Lincoln what Seward had said he needed, though at a price no paper could contain. Before the proclamation could be announced, the military result had to become clear enough to bear the weight of public action. Antietam had opened the door, but only barely. The next measure of that opening would come as the Army of Northern Virginia faced the question of whether it could remain in Maryland at all. The opening at Antietam did not appear all at once. It emerged slowly, through exhaustion, hesitation, and the grim arithmetic of what was left on the field. When the firing faded on September 17, 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia had not been destroyed. The Army of the Potomac had not delivered the kind of sweeping victory that fills proclamations with certainty. What existed instead was something thinner. Lee's first invasion of the North had been stopped, but the Confederate Army still stood near Sharpsburg, and the Union Army still had to discover whether the day's terrible cost had produced a result large enough for Washington to use. That uncertainty is part of why Antietam mattered so much. It was not a clean military triumph. It was a battlefield so costly that its political meaning had to be drawn carefully from the movement of armies after the guns fell quiet. Lincoln needed more than courage from his soldiers. He needed an outcome that could answer Seward's warning from July, that emancipation should not be announced from a posture of defeat or desperation. Antietam gave him that possibility, but only because Lee's campaign in Maryland came to an end. The end came on the night of September 18, 1862. After holding near the battlefield through the day following the battle, the Army of Northern Virginia retreated back across the Potomac into Virginia. That movement changed the meaning of what had happened near Antietam Creek. Lee had entered Maryland carrying the war northward. He left with the invasion checked. The Union had not annihilated his army, but it had forced the Confederate commander to abandon his first invasion of the North. For Lincoln, that distinction mattered. A victory did not have to be perfect to be politically usable. It had to be real enough to show that the United States government was not speaking from collapse. The retreat into Virginia gave Antietam that shape. It allowed the administration to treat the battle not merely as a day of suffering, but as the moment when a Confederate offensive had failed. The door that had opened on September 17th was narrow, but by the night of September 18th it had not closed. To understand how narrow it was, it helps to return to the battlefield in its final hours. The National Park Service account of Antietam makes clear that the Union opportunity late in the day was both forceful and fragile. On the southern part of the field, Major General Ambrose Burnside's men finally pushed forward in the afternoon. Their attack pressed against the Confederate right and created a moment when Lee's line was under serious threat. The numbers themselves show the narrowing of that effort. According to the National Park Service overview, about 8,000 men began Burnside's late afternoon assault. About 4,000 reached a halfway point. About 2,000 pushed on toward the end of the Confederate line. That reduction is more than a statistic. It shows how combat converted an attack into a smaller and smaller blade. What began as a broad movement became a thin pressure at the edge of Lee's position. The Union Army had men on the field, and it had momentum in that sector, but the movement had already been worn down by terrain, fire, and the long delay of the day. By the time the attack reached toward the Confederate flank, its force had narrowed dramatically. The chance was there, but it was fragile. Then came another measure of how close the battle had been. A.P. Hill's Confederate troops arrived after a rapid march from Harper's Ferry. The National Park Service notes that Hill's men marched approximately 15 miles to reach the Antietam battlefield on September 17th. Their arrival struck into the moment when Burnside's attack was pressing forward. In the story of the Emancipation Proclamation, this battlefield detail matters because it reminds us that Lincoln's political opening depended on events that nearly turned another way. Hill's march from Harper's Ferry was not an abstract reinforcement on a map. It was the arrival of men at a critical hour, after miles of movement, into a field already marked by immense casualties. Their presence helped blunt the late Union push. Burnside's attack had threatened to roll up the end of the Confederate line, but the Confederate reinforcement narrowed the Union opportunity just as it appeared. The battle's final phase did not produce a decisive collapse. It produced a checked invasion, a battered enemy, and a field too costly for easy language. This is where Antietam's power as a turning point becomes complicated. It was not the kind of battlefield result that allowed anyone to pretend the war had suddenly become simple. The National Park Service describes Antietam as the single bloodiest day in United States history. About 12 hours of fighting on September 17th left about 23,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. That scale of loss did not automatically translate into clarity. The dead and wounded could not explain what the battle meant. Commanders, governments, and the public would do that afterward. Yet the military fact that mattered most for Lincoln's timing was plain enough. Lee did not remain in Maryland. On the night of September 18th, the Army of Northern Virginia withdrew into Virginia. The first invasion of the North was over. The Confederate Army had survived, but its movement north had failed. The Union could claim that it had repelled Lee's campaign. It could claim that the Army of the Potomac had blocked the Confederate advance on Union soil. It could claim a success large enough to support a public act that had been waiting since summer. The narrowness of the opportunity also helps explain the caution and timing that followed. Lincoln did not issue the preliminary proclamation on the battlefield or on the morning after the fighting. He waited until the military result had settled into something usable. The movement back into Virginia mattered because it gave the administration a firmer ground from which to speak. A proclamation announcing a new war policy needed to sound like an act of command, not a plea sent out amid panic. This is the quiet connection between Sharpsburg and Washington. The battle itself did not write the proclamation. Lincoln had already read an early version to his cabinet on July 22, 1862. The policy had already been forming in relation to the Second Confiscation Act, approved July 17th. Seward had already advised delay until a Union success could support the announcement. What Antietam supplied was not the idea of emancipation, but the public circumstance in which that idea could be released. And even then, the circumstance was edged with uncertainty. The Union victory was strategic, not absolute. Lee's army escaped. The losses were staggering. The late afternoon chance on the Confederate right had been real, but it had narrowed from about 8,000 men to about 4,000, then to about 2,000, pressing toward the end of the line. A.P. Hill's men, after their approximate 15-mile march from Harper's Ferry, arrived in time to effect the result. These details keep the story from becoming too smooth. The political opening that followed Antietam was not wide, clean, or inevitable. It was made from survival, endurance, and a Confederate withdrawal after a day no one could afford to repeat. Still, history often turns on openings that are not as large as they appear later. By the time Lee's army crossed back into Virginia, the administration in Washington had what it had been waiting for. The Confederacy's first northern invasion had ended. The Union had a success, however costly. The president could now move the emancipation policy from private intention to public warning. 5 days after the battle, on September 22, 1862, Lincoln would act. The page that had waited through July and August, and then through the bloodshed near Antietam Creek, would become a public instrument of war. Its language would not yet be the final proclamation of January 1, 1863. It would be a warning with a deadline, addressed to the states and parts of states still in rebellion. Antietam had not made the road easy. It had made the road possible. The opening that Antietam created was narrow, but Lincoln did not let it close. For weeks, the emancipation policy had existed as a decision waiting for the right public moment. It had been read to the cabinet in July. It had been held back after William H. Seward warned that the government should not appear to be announcing freedom as an act of desperation. It had waited through the uncertainty of late summer, and then through the terrible fighting near Sharpsburg, Maryland. Now Lee's army had withdrawn across the Potomac. The first Confederate invasion of the North had been stopped. The Union did not have the crushing victory some had hoped for, but it had a result strong enough to carry a change in policy. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. That word, preliminary, matters. This was not yet the final order that would be issued on January 1, 1863, in the city of Washington. It was a warning, and it was built around a deadline. It told the states and parts of states in rebellion that the United States government was giving them a fixed period of time. If, on January 1, 1863, they were still in rebellion against the United States, then the enslaved people within those states or designated parts of states would be declared free. The proclamation was therefore both immediate and delayed. It acted at once by changing the public purpose of the war, but its central enforcement date lay ahead. Lincoln was not simply announcing an aspiration. He was setting a test. The rebellion now had a calendar attached to it. Continue past the first day of the new year, and slavery in the areas covered by the order would become a direct target of Union war policy. This was the heart of the preliminary warning. It did not say that slavery would end everywhere in the United States. It did not reach the loyal border states that had remained in the Union. It did not operate as a general abolition measure across every place where slavery still existed. Lincoln's authority, as he would make explicit in the Final Proclamation, rested on his position as commander-in-chief during an armed rebellion. The policy was shaped as a war measure, aimed at places where the United States claimed the right to use military power to suppress that rebellion. That limitation has always been part of the proclamation's meaning. It was not a simple universal decree, But the limitation was also part of its legal design. Lincoln was not acting as though he could, by ordinary presidential power, abolish slavery everywhere. He was acting in the context of civil war, and he was directing the force of the federal government toward territory still resisting federal authority. The preliminary proclamation made that logic public. Before this date, the Union war effort had not been officially defined by emancipation as a central aim. The war had begun, publicly, as a struggle to preserve the Union. Slavery was always at the center of the conflict's causes and realities, and enslaved people themselves were already forcing the issue by seeking freedom wherever Union lines came near. Congress had also acted through measures such as the Second Confiscation Act, approved on July 17, 1862. But the president had not yet formally announced that emancipation in rebel-held territory would become an instrument of national war policy. On September 22nd, that changed. The timing was inseparable from Antietam. The battle had been fought on September 17th. The National Park Service describes it as the single bloodiest day in United States history, with about 23,000 soldiers killed, wounded, or missing after about 12 hours of combat. The suffering on that field did not produce a simple military triumph. Lee's army survived. McClellan did not destroy the Army of Northern Virginia. But Lee's first invasion of the North ended when the Confederate Army retreated back into Virginia on the night of September 18th. That was enough for Lincoln to act. The preliminary proclamation took the military opening and transformed it into political language. The Union's success in Maryland gave the announcement the posture Seward had thought essential. It would not look like the last cry of a defeated government. It would come after a Confederate advance into the North had been checked. It would come from a president whose army had forced Lee back across the river. It would speak not from collapse, but from endurance. And its message to the Confederacy was severe. The rebellion could not continue while expecting slavery to remain untouched by the federal war effort. The system that supported Confederate society, labor, and military strength would no longer be treated as something outside the battlefield. If Confederate states continued to fight, Lincoln warned, the United States would use its war powers to strike at slavery within the areas under rebellion. The document also created a new relationship between time and freedom. January 1st, 1863 became more than the beginning of a calendar year. It became a line drawn through the war. On one side stood the preliminary warning. On the other stood the promised final action. Every week that passed after September 22nd carried the question forward. Would rebellion continue, and if it did, would the government follow through? The answer was embedded in the warning itself. Lincoln did not present emancipation as a vague possibility. He stated the consequence in advance. Enslaved people in the states or parts of states still in rebellion on January 1st would be declared free. That future tense gave the proclamation its force. It was not yet the final blow, but it told everyone where the blow would fall. For the Union government, this public deadline required preparation. A policy that had lived in private discussion now had to become an operating principle of war. Military and naval authorities would eventually be tied to the task of recognizing and maintaining the freedom of those declared free. Union advances into Confederate territory would no longer be only movements of armies across land. They would become movements that carried the promise of emancipation into the places named by federal policy. For enslaved people, the preliminary proclamation did not mean freedom arrived everywhere at once. The reality on the ground depended on military power, movement, self-emancipation, and the reach of Union forces. But the meaning of the war had changed in public. The President of the United States had announced that continued rebellion would bring federal recognition of freedom to enslaved people in the affected areas. The warning gave official language to what many enslaved people already understood through experience. The advance of Union power could become an opening toward liberty. For the Confederacy, the message was equally plain. The war could no longer be fought under the assumption that slavery would remain protected if the Union were restored. The institution at the center of Confederate power was now exposed to direct military action by the United States. What had been treated by Confederate leaders as a foundation of their new nation was being identified by Lincoln as a vulnerability in rebellion. The preliminary proclamation also mattered beyond the battlefield and the slaveholding South. By making emancipation an explicit Union war objective, Lincoln altered the diplomatic and moral shape of the conflict. Foreign governments, especially Britain and France, now had to view the war in light of a declared anti-slavery policy. In countries where anti-slavery opinion mattered, support for the Confederacy became harder to justify. The document did not settle diplomacy by itself, but it shifted the terms on which the outside world would read the American war. Still, the document's greatest power lay in its combination of restraint and threat. It did not claim to do everything. It did not promise immediate freedom in every enslaved community. It did not abolish slavery throughout the entire United States. That would require later constitutional change, completed by the 13th Amendment after the war. But within the boundaries Lincoln set, the preliminary proclamation was unmistakable. It turned the continuation of rebellion into the condition that would trigger emancipation as federal war policy. That is why September 22, 1862, stands as more than an administrative date. It was the day Lincoln moved from waiting to warning. The page that had been held back through July and August, and then through the bloodshed of Antietam, now entered the public life of the nation. It gave the Confederacy a deadline. It gave the Union government a direction. It gave enslaved people in the designated rebel areas a promise that the war itself might become a path toward recognized freedom. But a warning is not the same as fulfillment. After September 22nd, the country entered a period of suspense. The date of January 1st, 1863, now stood ahead of the war like a fixed marker. The rebellion had been told what would happen if it continued. The Union had announced what it was preparing to do. Between the preliminary proclamation and the final one lay a waiting period, not empty, but charged with consequence, as the government, the armies, and millions of enslaved people moved toward the first day of the new year. The waiting period began with a date. After September 22nd, 1862, the preliminary proclamation was no longer only a policy inside the administration. It was a public warning, placed before the states and parts of states still in rebellion. If rebellion continued into January 1st, 1863, enslaved people in those designated places would be declared free. The sentence did not end the matter at once. It opened a span of time in which the meaning of the war began to shift before the final order had even been signed. That is what made the months between the preliminary and final proclamation so important. They were not a pause in the story. They were part of the instrument itself. Lincoln's September order worked by creating a deadline. It told the rebellion that the federal government would attach a specific consequence to continued resistance. The date ahead was not vague. It was not a general threat made in wartime anger. It was a marker on the calendar, and it gave the Confederate States a clear measure of what would follow if they remained in arms against the United States. In that sense, the preliminary proclamation was both warning and preparation. It warned the rebellion. It prepared the Union. The paper issued in September did not yet do everything the final proclamation would do. It did not yet name the states and exempted areas in the final form that would appear on January 1st. It did not yet stand as the completed wartime order that Lincoln would issue from the city of Washington. But it changed the ground beneath every political and military calculation. From that point forward, the administration had committed itself publicly to a policy that could not easily be withdrawn without changing the meaning of Union resolve. The war had begun as a struggle to preserve the Union. That purpose remained. But now the government had announced that if the rebellion continued, preservation of the Union would be joined to emancipation in rebel-held territory. The preliminary proclamation made that linkage visible before it made it final. This mattered because public policy in wartime does not move only through signatures. It moves through expectation. Soldiers, officials, diplomats, enslaved people, slaveholders, and foreign governments all had to reckon with what Lincoln had placed before them. The Union had not yet arrived at January 1st, but the country was already living under the shadow of that date. For the Confederate leadership, the warning was blunt. Slavery was not only a social system. It was also a labor system supporting the Confederate war effort. By threatening slavery in areas still in rebellion, Lincoln was not simply making a moral statement. He was identifying a structure that helped sustain the enemy's capacity to fight. The final proclamation would describe emancipation as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing rebellion. The waiting period allowed that logic to settle into public view. The Union government was preparing to say that freedom itself could be used as an instrument of war. That was a profound turn. Earlier in the conflict, the Union war effort had not been publicly defined by emancipation everywhere. The border states that remained loyal to the Union still mattered politically and militarily. Maryland, where Antietam had been fought, was itself a slave state that had stayed in the Union. Lincoln's policy had to move through that complicated constitutional and military landscape. The proclamation was powerful because it rested on wartime authority over areas in rebellion, but that same legal logic also gave it limits. The waiting period made those limits more visible. It showed that the policy was not a general decree abolishing slavery throughout the entire United States. It was aimed at states and parts of states still in rebellion on the appointed day. That distinction would shape the final document. It would also shape how people understood its power. The proclamation could transform the war without ending slavery everywhere at once. Here was one of the central tensions of the moment. The measure was limited, but not small. It did not reach every enslaved person in the country on the day it took effect. Yet it placed the authority of the federal government, the movement of Union armies, and the purpose of the war behind emancipation in the designated rebel territory. Once made final, every Union advance into those areas would carry more than military consequence. It would carry the promise that the government would recognize and maintain the freedom it had declared. Between September and January, that future mechanism was coming into focus. The phrase "recognize and maintain" belonged to the operational heart of the Final Proclamation. It would place responsibility not only on the president's words, but on the executive government, including military and naval authorities. Freedom would not be treated as a private hope alone. It would be attached to the machinery of the Union war effort. The Army and Navy would become part of the enforcement of the policy wherever federal power could reach. But in the waiting period, this was still approaching. The promise had been made. The machinery was not yet fully engaged. The war itself had to carry the policy from paper into territory. For enslaved people in the rebel states, the deadline must have had a different kind of meaning than it had in Washington. The research record shows that emancipation was never a single instant everywhere. Even after the Final Proclamation, freedom required military power, self-emancipation, and continued political struggle. In places beyond immediate Union control, the words of the government could not enforce themselves. The most dramatic example would come much later in Texas, where the Smithsonian notes that freedom was announced in Galveston Bay on June 19, 1865, when Union troops arrived there. That later delay helps us understand the waiting period more clearly. The proclamation was not a magic door that opened everywhere at the same moment. It was a wartime order whose force depended on armies, territory, and the destruction of Confederate power. But even before January 1st, the preliminary proclamation gave enslaved people in designated rebel areas a federal promise tied to the outcome of the war. It told them that the Union victory being fought for on fields like Antietam could become a victory against slavery itself. The waiting period also carried diplomatic weight. By announcing emancipation as a Union war aim in rebel-held territory, Lincoln made foreign support for the Confederacy more politically difficult. Britain and France were watching the conflict, and anti-slavery opinion mattered there. A war that had once been framed abroad as a contest over Union now had a declared anti-slavery direction. The preliminary proclamation did not settle foreign policy by itself, but it changed the moral and political atmosphere in which foreign governments had to consider the Confederacy. That was part of the power of issuing the warning after Antietam. Seward's concern had been that emancipation should not look like a cry of desperation. Antietam had been terrible, costly, and far from a clean triumph, but it had ended Lee's first invasion of the North. It had given Lincoln the opening to speak from a position that could be understood as strength rather than panic. Once the preliminary proclamation was public, the administration used the months that followed not to ask whether the policy should exist, but to move toward making it final if rebellion continued. The calendar did some of the work. Each passing week made the issue less theoretical. October, November, and December carried the country closer to a fixed point. The Confederacy did not return to loyalty. The rebellion did not end before the new year. The warning therefore moved toward fulfillment. Inside the larger history of the Civil War, this waiting period can look quiet when compared with the bloodshed at Antietam or the ceremony of January 1st. But its quietness is misleading. It was the interval in which a private policy became an unavoidable public commitment. It was the time when the Union government stood between announcement and action, with its own authority now bound to the deadline it had created. The one page of ink in the title of this story is a metaphor, because the official government copy preserved by the National Archives would be 5 pages. But the metaphor captures something real about this moment. A written order had begun to change the war before the final version was issued. Ink had created a date. The date had created pressure. The pressure had made continued rebellion carry a declared consequence. By the end of December, the waiting was nearly over. The preliminary warning had done its work. It had marked the path from Antietam to emancipation as a war measure. It had told the rebellious states what persistence would cost. It had prepared the Union government to attach military authority to freedom. And it had drawn the country toward the first morning of 1863, when Lincoln, in the city of Washington, would issue the final proclamation and name the places where the order would apply. The waiting ended not with a battlefield charge, but with a document in Washington. On January 1st, 1863, after months of warning and after the deadline in the preliminary proclamation had passed, Abraham Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation from the city of Washington. The war had already taken tens of thousands of lives. Armies still moved across contested ground. The rebellion had not ended. And so the consequence Lincoln had announced in September now became the policy of the United States government. The final proclamation did not speak in the language of sudden universal abolition. Its power came through a narrower, wartime channel. It named the places where the president declared enslaved people to be free, because those places were, in the judgment of the government, still in rebellion against the United States. That naming mattered. It turned a general warning into an operative order. It drew a map in words. The proclamation listed Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. These were not abstract categories. They were states at the center of the Confederate war effort, places where slavery remained deeply tied to labor, agriculture, military support, and political power. By naming them, Lincoln attached emancipation to the geography of rebellion. The document said, in effect, that continued resistance to the United States would now bring federal war power directly against slavery in the areas covered by the order. But the list was not simple. Even as the proclamation named states, it also carved out exceptions. It identified places within those states that were not to be treated in the same way under this particular order. The final proclamation, therefore, did 2 things at once. It announced freedom for enslaved people in designated rebellious areas, and it carefully marked where that announcement did not apply. In Louisiana, the proclamation exempted New Orleans and a series of named parishes. Those exempted areas included St. Bernard, Plaquemine, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Ascension, Assumption, Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Orleans. These names gave the document a striking administrative precision. This was not merely a moral declaration written in broad strokes. It was a legal and military instrument, identifying political geography parish by parish. Virginia was treated in the same exacting way. The proclamation exempted the 48 counties then designated as West Virginia. It also exempted Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk counties, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth. Again, the detail was essential. The proclamation did not simply say Virginia and leave the matter there. It named Virginia, then stated which portions were outside the reach of this particular wartime emancipation order. Those exemptions can make the proclamation appear, at first glance, less sweeping than the memory of it sometimes suggests. And in a strict legal sense, it was limited. It did not abolish slavery throughout the entire United States. It did not apply to loyal border states where slavery still existed, but which had not joined the rebellion. It also did not apply to certain parts of Confederate states already under Union control. Its reach followed the logic Lincoln was using. The president was acting as commander-in-chief during an armed rebellion, and the measure was framed as a war measure for suppressing that rebellion. That is why the geography mattered so much. The proclamation was not a peacetime statute passed by Congress to end slavery everywhere. It was an executive wartime order directed at the rebellion's territory and its sustaining labor system. It made emancipation an instrument of military policy, not separate from the war, but embedded within it. The order's force came from the claim that the rebellion itself had created the necessity for such action. And yet, its limits did not make it insignificant. They reveal how carefully Lincoln moved through the constitutional and political constraints around him. The proclamation was both bold and bounded. It reached into the Confederacy's heartland, but it did not claim powers beyond the legal theory on which it rested. It changed the war while also showing the structure of the government's argument. Rebellion had opened the way for military emancipation in rebellious places. The Final Proclamation also carried forward the central promise of the preliminary one. In September, Lincoln had warned that enslaved people in states or parts of states still in rebellion on January 1st would be declared free. On the first day of the new year, he declared that condition met. The rebellion had continued. The deadline had passed. The warning became action. The language of the Final Proclamation did more than identify territory. It placed the executive government of the United States behind the freedom it declared. The order stated that the executive government, including the military and naval authorities, would recognize and maintain the freedom of the people it covered. That phrase was crucial. Freedom was not to remain only a sentence on paper. The Army and Navy, as they entered in occupied designated areas, were to treat the people declared free as free people. This was the bridge between ink and ground. In places still under Confederate control, the proclamation could not be fully enforced the moment it was signed. No document by itself could open every plantation, protect every family, or overcome every armed force. Enforcement depended on military movement, on the presence of Union power, and on the actions of enslaved people who had already been pushing the war toward emancipation by fleeing, laboring, resisting, and reaching Union lines. But the federal government had now made its position explicit. Where the proclamation applied, Union advance and the recognition of freedom were tied together. The date gives the chapter its drama, but the structure gives it its meaning. January 1st, 1863, was not a magical instant when slavery vanished everywhere. It was the moment the United States government formally made emancipation in rebel-held territory a declared objective of the war. The conflict to preserve the Union now carried within it a direct assault on slavery, where rebellion continued. The document also marked a transformation in who could participate in the war. The Final Proclamation announced that black men of suitable condition would be received into the armed service of the United States. They could serve in garrisoning forts, positions, stations, and other places, and in manning vessels. That provision would deepen the proclamation's effect in the months and years ahead. It did not only speak about enslaved and free black people as subjects of policy. It opened a path for black military service within the Union war effort. On that New Year's Day in Washington, the Final Proclamation therefore stood at several crossroads at once. It was a legal order, grounded in wartime authority. It was a military measure aimed at weakening the Confederacy. It was a political declaration that changed the meaning of the Union cause. And it was a moral turning point, even though its immediate reach was neither universal nor simple. The names inside the document remind us that emancipation, as federal policy, arrived through boundaries. Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia were named, but not every place within the broader world of slavery was touched in the same way. New Orleans and Louisiana parishes were exempted. West Virginia's 48 counties and specific Virginia counties and cities were exempted. Loyal slave states were outside the order altogether. That tension is the heart of the Final Proclamation. It changed the war profoundly, but it did so through a map marked by law, military control, and rebellion. To understand its power, we have to hold both truths together. The proclamation made freedom an official Union war aim in the areas it covered, and it left important boundaries in place. The ink had changed the purpose and machinery of the conflict. But the freedom it declared would have to move through exemptions, armies, contested territory, and the unfinished struggle to make the promise real. The boundary line mattered because it showed what kind of document Lincoln had made. The Final Proclamation did not speak as a general abolition law for every enslaved person in the United States. It spoke as a wartime order, aimed at places the federal government defined as being in rebellion. Its power was immense, but it was not universal. Its promise was revolutionary, but it moved through carefully named limits. That is why the map inside the proclamation is so important. It did not simply name the Confederate states and stop there. It named areas where the Declaration would apply, and it also named areas where it would not. The result was a document that can sound, at first, broader than it was. It declared freedom for enslaved people in designated rebellious territory, but it did not abolish slavery in loyal slave states. It did not immediately end slavery in every place under the American flag. It did not free every enslaved person on the morning of January 1st, 1863. This was the central contradiction of emancipation by proclamation. It was a declaration of freedom with boundaries. The loyal border states were outside the order. These were slave states that had remained in the Union, and because they were not treated as areas in rebellion, they were not covered by Lincoln's wartime emancipation order. That fact can be jarring, because it means slavery survived legally in some places loyal to the United States even after the proclamation was issued. The document changed the purpose of the war, but it did not by itself erase slavery from the entire nation. The reason lay in the legal and military logic of the proclamation. Lincoln was not claiming, in this document, a general peacetime power to abolish slavery everywhere. He was acting against rebellion. He was using the war power of the presidency in the places where the United States was fighting to suppress an armed revolt. That meant the order's geography followed the geography of rebellion, not the full geography of slavery. The same logic also explains why parts of Confederate states were exempted. Some areas in the seceded states were already under Union control or were being treated differently for purposes of the proclamation. In those places, Lincoln did not use the same wartime declaration. The order marked off not only states, but counties, parishes, cities, and regions. Freedom in the proclamation came through a map of military status and political control. Louisiana gives one of the clearest examples. The Final Proclamation named Louisiana among the states in rebellion, but it did not include all of Louisiana within the declaration. It exempted New Orleans, a city of enormous strategic and symbolic importance, and then listed a series of parishes that were also outside the order. The exempted Louisiana areas included the parishes of St. Bernard, Plaquemines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Ascension, Assumption, Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Orleans. The list is precise. It is not the language of a broad moral statement alone. It is the language of administration, of government power, moving through named jurisdictions. New Orleans was not simply a point on the map. It was one of the places where Union control had already altered the situation on the ground. The proclamation, therefore, treated it differently from the parts of Louisiana still classed within the rebellion. This is where the document's limits become more than technical details. For an enslaved person in one Louisiana parish, the proclamation could mark a direct federal declaration of freedom. For another person in a neighboring exempted area, the same document might not apply in the same immediate way. The moral claim was expanding, but the legal instrument was bounded. The war aim had changed, but enforcement depended on status, place, and power. Virginia showed the same kind of boundary making, but on an even more intricate scale. The Final Proclamation named Virginia as one of the rebellious states, yet it carved out major exceptions. It exempted the 48 counties designated as West Virginia. It also exempted Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk counties. The exemption included Norfolk and Portsmouth. Again, the details matter. These were not accidental omissions. They were named exclusions written into the structure of the order. The 48 counties designated as West Virginia were treated apart from the rest of Virginia. Other counties and cities were also separated from the proclamation's direct reach. The result was a fractured map where the force of federal emancipation did not fall evenly across the old boundaries of a state. To read those names closely is to see how the proclamation operated. It did not say that slavery was abolished in Virginia in every county and every city. It said that enslaved people in the parts of Virginia covered by the order were declared free, while other parts were specifically excluded. This was freedom announced through the language of wartime jurisdiction. For later generations, the phrase Emancipation Proclamation can sound like a single national act of abolition. But the historical document was narrower. It did not complete the destruction of slavery in the United States. Nationwide abolition came later, after the war, through the 13th Amendment. The proclamation was a turning point, not the final legal endpoint. That distinction does not reduce its importance. In some ways, it helps explain its importance more clearly. Lincoln's order took a war that had begun, publicly, as a struggle to preserve the Union, and made emancipation in rebel-held territory an official objective of the Union war effort. It meant that the federal government would now treat slavery in those places not as something to be left untouched if the Union were restored, but as a target of military policy. The institution that supported the Confederate war effort would now be attacked by the advance of Union power. But the attack was not everywhere at once. In the border states, slavery remained beyond the proclamation's direct reach. In exempted areas of Louisiana and Virginia, the proclamation did not declare immediate freedom under its terms. In territories still under Confederate control, its promise was real as federal policy, but it still had to be enforced. A declaration in Washington could change the legal and moral direction of the war, but it could not instantly place Union authority in every plantation district, courthouse, and river town across the South. That is why the proclamation must be understood as both a document and a process. The ink mattered because it authorized a new purpose. It told the Army and Navy, and the country, that freedom in designated rebellious areas was now part of the Union's war. Yet the lived reality of that freedom depended on movement, armies advancing, Confederate control weakening, enslaved people reaching Union lines, and federal authority becoming present where it had only been promised. The boundaries also reveal Lincoln's caution. He was making a radical move through a constrained legal form. He did not write as if presidential will alone could abolish slavery throughout the Republic. He wrote within the framework he believed wartime authority allowed: rebellion, military necessity, and the power of the commander-in-chief. The exemptions were not incidental to that logic. They were part of it. So the proclamation stands in a difficult balance. It was limited enough that slavery continued in parts of the United States after January 1, 1863. It was powerful enough that the Union could no longer wage the war as if slavery's future were separate from victory. It did not free everyone at once, but it made freedom a military commitment of the United States in the places it named. This is the quiet force of the chapter's boundaries. They show us a proclamation that was not magic, not total, and not self-enforcing. They also show us why it changed the war. By defining where emancipation applied, Lincoln defined how federal power would move. The document's limits were the shape of its legal claim. Its map was the field on which the promise would have to be carried out. And beneath every exemption, the larger mechanism was waiting to be understood. The proclamation's power did not rest only in its list of states, parishes, counties, and cities. It rested in the authority Lincoln claimed to make such a list matter. He issued it not as a peacetime reform, but as an act of war, grounded in his role as commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy during an armed rebellion. Freedom had boundaries on the page, but those boundaries were drawn by a wartime power that would now be turned against the rebellion itself. The map of the proclamation showed where Lincoln meant the order to apply. But the map alone did not explain why he believed he could issue it. That deeper explanation was legal, military, and constitutional at the same time. The Final Proclamation was not written as a general law passed by Congress. It was not presented as a peacetime act of reform. It was framed as an order made by the President of the United States in the middle of an armed rebellion while commanding the Army and Navy of the United States. That distinction was not a technicality. It was the hinge on which the document turned. Lincoln had long understood that the federal government's power over slavery was not the same everywhere. In loyal states where slavery still existed, the question was different from the question inside territory actively used to sustain rebellion. The proclamation's boundaries reflected that difference, but its authority came from a sharper wartime claim that slavery, in the areas named, was not only a social institution or a system of property claims. It was also part of the enemy's power. It supported labor, production, movement, and the Confederacy's capacity to continue the war. To strike that system in the territory still in rebellion was, in Lincoln's argument, to strike the rebellion itself. The proclamation therefore spoke in the language of military necessity. Lincoln grounded his action in his role as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy. He described the measure as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing rebellion. Those words mattered because they explained what kind of power he was using. He was not claiming that he could abolish slavery everywhere by executive will. He was claiming that, during an armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, the Commander-in-Chief could take measures aimed at weakening the enemy and restoring national authority. The document's force came from that connection between emancipation and suppression of rebellion. This is why the proclamation's limits and its power cannot be separated. Its limitations were not only political compromises or administrative details, though they were certainly shaped by politics and by the reality of Union control. They were also part of the legal structure of the order. The proclamation applied where Lincoln asserted war powers against rebellion. It did not apply where the federal government was not treating a state or locality as being in rebellion. In this way, the document's geography was part of its legal argument. That argument had been forming for months before January 1st, 1863. Lincoln had first read an early version of the policy to his cabinet on July 22nd, 1862. That first cabinet reading came soon after the Second Confiscation Act, approved on July 17th, 1862. The policy was not improvised on New Year's Day. It moved through legislation, cabinet discussion, military calculation, and public warning. By the time the Final Proclamation appeared, its language had been shaped by the long pressure of war. And war was the essential setting. Without the rebellion, the claim would have been different. Without armies in the field, the mechanism would have been weaker. Without the battlefield opening after Antietam, the public timing would have carried a different meaning. Secretary of State William H. Seward had warned that if Lincoln announced emancipation after a string of setbacks, it might look like desperation. The Union needed a moment that could carry the policy as strength, not collapse. Antietam, costly and incomplete as it was, provided that opening because Robert E. Lee's first invasion of the North ended when the Army of Northern Virginia retreated back into Virginia. But Antietam did not by itself free anyone. It made room for the preliminary proclamation on September 22, 1862. That preliminary order announced the condition. If the rebellion continued into January 1, 1863, enslaved people in the states or parts of states still in rebellion would be declared free. The waiting period was not just delay. It was a deadline. It placed the government's warning into the public record. It gave the rebellious states a clear consequence. It allowed the Final Proclamation to appear not as a sudden impulse, but as the fulfillment of a wartime notice. By January 1st, the legal mechanism had sharpened. The Final Proclamation named the places where the order applied and identified the places it exempted. Then it anchored that list in the president's wartime authority. Lincoln issued the proclamation from the city of Washington, not as a symbolic gesture alone, but as an executive act meant to change how the war would be conducted. The phrase fit and necessary war measure carried a heavy burden. It declared that emancipation in the designated areas was not separate from military strategy. It was military strategy. The Union was no longer only fighting armies while leaving the labor system behind those armies untouched. The proclamation made slavery in rebel-held territory a target of federal war policy. It told the Army and Navy that the destruction of slavery's power in those places was now tied to the suppression of the rebellion. This did not make the proclamation self-enforcing. Ink could declare a policy, but it could not occupy a road, hold a river, secure a town, or protect a family crossing into Union lines. That was why the document's military character was so important. A war measure required war power to become real. It depended on armies moving through territory, naval forces controlling waterways and coasts, and federal authority expanding where Confederate power retreated. The proclamation's legal claim and its military mechanism, therefore, reinforced each other. The law of the document made sense because it was tied to military necessity. The military campaign gained a new moral and political objective because the document told Union forces what their advance now meant. Wherever the proclamation applied, movement by the United States Army and Navy could become more than a campaign for ground. It could become a campaign that carried the federal promise of freedom into places where the rebellion had tried to preserve slavery. This is the turning point at the center of the story. Lincoln did not end slavery everywhere in the United States with one executive order. The proclamation did not reach the loyal border states. It did not undo every exemption. It did not complete nationwide abolition, which would come through the 13th Amendment after the war. But within the areas it named, the proclamation transformed the character of Union power. It made emancipation an authorized instrument of war. That transformation also changed the meaning of loyalty and rebellion. The places still in rebellion were not merely resisting taxation, law, or federal command. They were now continuing a war in which their persistence placed slavery directly in the path of federal military action. The preliminary proclamation had warned them of this. The final proclamation carried it out. The continued rebellion became the condition that activated the order. Lincoln's language was careful because the stakes were enormous. A broader proclamation, detached from military authority, might have been easier to denounce as beyond executive power. A narrower proclamation, tied only to symbolism, might have failed to change the war. Instead, Lincoln fused the two elements that gave the order its force: constitutional command and battlefield necessity. He acted as commander-in-chief, and he described emancipation in the designated rebellious areas as a measure for suppressing rebellion. The result was a document with boundaries, but not a weak document. Its boundaries were part of the architecture that allowed it to stand as a war measure. Its power came from being aimed at the enemy's capacity to fight. It turned the institution the Confederacy fought to protect into a vulnerability that Union policy would now attack. And once that shift occurred, the proclamation could not remain only a declaration on paper. If freedom was now a war measure, someone had to carry it into the field. Someone had to decide what federal officers would do when enslaved people reached Union lines, when Union troops entered a town, when naval forces approached a coast, when Confederate authority gave way. The proclamation answered that problem with another essential phrase. The executive government of the United States, including military and naval authorities, would recognize and maintain the freedom of the people it declared free. That was where the war measure became operational. The commander-in-chief had made the claim. The Army and Navy would be required to give it meaning. The phrase carried the war measure out of the cabinet room and into the path of armies. Lincoln had claimed authority as commander-in-chief. He had described emancipation in the designated rebellious areas as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing the rebellion. But a military order has to do more than state a principle. It has to tell the government how to behave when the principle meets the ground. That is why the words recognize and maintain matter so much. The final Emancipation Proclamation declared that the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authorities, would recognize and maintain the freedom of the people it declared free. The sentence was brief, but it was operational. It told federal power what freedom would require of it. It did not merely announce that enslaved people in the named areas were free. It said that the government of the United States would treat them as free and would uphold that freedom through the institutions already engaged in the war. That made the proclamation more than a statement of sympathy. It made it an instruction. The executive government meant the machinery of federal authority under the president. The military and naval authorities meant the officers and forces pushing against Confederate power on land and water. In the context of the Civil War, those were not distant administrative terms. They were the instruments through which the United States could reach places where civil law alone could not yet function. The proclamation applied to designated areas still in rebellion. Those were places where the federal government claimed authority, but where Confederate control still had to be broken by force. So the order's promise could not become reality everywhere at once. It would follow the pressure of Union power. It would move as armies moved. It would become enforceable as Confederate authority retreated. This is one of the central contradictions of the proclamation and one of the keys to its power. On the morning it was issued in the city of Washington, it did not instantly free every enslaved person in every named place in a practical, protected sense. In many areas, Confederate power remained in place. Enslavers still held people in bondage. Union officers were far away. The proclamation's words did not magically dissolve that reality, but the document changed what would happen when that reality was challenged. Before this turn, a Union advance into Confederate territory might be understood primarily as a military movement to occupy ground, seize positions, control roads, take ports, or weaken the enemy's army. After the proclamation, Every such advance also carried another meaning. It became tied to the expansion and protection of freedom in the areas covered by the order. When federal forces entered territory named in the proclamation, they entered with a new obligation. The freedom declared on the page was to be recognized and maintained by the government's own power. That mattered in a war where territory was never just geography. Plantations, towns, roads, rivers, and coastlines were all part of the Confederate war system. Enslaved labor supported that system. The proclamation struck at slavery not only as a moral wrong, but as a structure that helped sustain the rebellion. To recognize and maintain freedom was therefore both a human act and a military act. It weakened the labor system behind the Confederacy while changing the status of the people whom that system had held. The words also mattered because they placed federal officers under a new expectation. When enslaved people reached Union lines, the question was no longer only what could be improvised in the field. When Union forces moved into designated Confederate territory, the question was no longer simply how to manage property claimed by loyal or disloyal masters. The proclamation had spoken in the name of the executive government. It said that the people it declared free were to be treated as free, and that their freedom was to be maintained. That phrase did not solve every problem. It did not erase the exemptions already written into the document. It did not abolish slavery throughout the loyal border states. It did not reach the named Louisiana parishes and Virginia areas that had been set outside its operation because of their particular relationship to Union control. It did not complete nationwide abolition. That would require the 13th Amendment after the war. But within the territory it did cover, it gave Union authority a new task. The task was not passive. To recognize freedom is to acknowledge a change in legal and political status. To maintain freedom is to defend that status against being reversed. In the wartime setting of 1863, that meant the proclamation depended on continued Union action. It had to be carried by the Army and Navy into spaces where Confederate authority still denied it. It had to survive contact with retreating armies, contested counties, occupied towns, and coastlines where naval power could open a path before civil government had returned. This is why the proclamation cannot be measured only by what happened at the instant of signing. Its force unfolded over time. Each Union movement into covered Confederate territory became part of the document's enforcement. A column on the march, a garrison holding a position, a naval vessel controlling a river or coast, a federal command replacing Confederate power, all of these could become ways the promise on the page acquired practical force. The proclamation had turned the war into a moving boundary between slavery protected by rebellion and freedom backed by federal arms. That boundary was uneven. It shifted with campaigns, occupation, resistance, and retreat. In some places, enforcement came late. Texas stands as one of the clearest reminders. The Smithsonian notes that freedom was announced in Galveston Bay on June 19, 1865, when Union troops arrived there. That was more than 2 years after the final proclamation. The delay shows the hard truth behind the phrase, recognize and maintain. Freedom declared by the federal government still had to be made real where federal power had not yet arrived. But that delay does not make the words weak. It shows what kind of instrument the proclamation was. It was a wartime order designed to operate through wartime power. It did not pretend that ink alone could occupy a county, control a port, or protect a family fleeing bondage. Instead, it placed the authority of the United States behind a new policy and directed the government's military and naval arms to uphold it. In this sense, every Union advance after January 1, 1863, carried a political meaning that earlier advances had not carried in the same official way. The war was still a fight to preserve the Union, but now, in the designated areas, preservation of the Union was formally linked to the destruction of slavery as a Confederate institution. The Army and Navy were no longer only instruments for defeating opposing armies. They were also instruments through which the federal government would recognize and maintain the freedom of human beings who had been held as property under the system the rebellion defended. That change reached beyond battlefield maps. It changed the relationship between enslaved people and the Union war effort. People escaping slavery had already been forcing the question upon federal commanders by coming to Union lines and making their own claims to freedom. The proclamation did not create their desire to be free, and it did not begin their resistance. but it altered the official position of the United States toward them in the covered areas. It told federal authorities that these were not people to be returned to bondage under the old assumptions. They were people whose freedom the government had pledged to recognize and maintain. That pledge also gave the proclamation its quiet momentum. It did not have to be repeated at every mile of a campaign to matter. It sat behind the movement of federal forces as an instruction from the commander-in-chief. Wherever the order applied and Union power could reach, military success and emancipation were now joined. A captured place was not only a captured place. A broken line was not only a military gain. A Confederate retreat could also open space in which the proclamation's promise became enforceable. The legal language was spare, but the consequences were broad. Lincoln had not written a poem of liberation. He had written an executive order in wartime. Its power lay partly in that restraint. It named authorities. It defined a duty. It connected the highest level of the federal government to the officers and forces carrying the war forward. And by doing so, it transformed emancipation from a future hope into an active policy of the United States in rebellion-held territory. The words recognize and maintain also reveal why the proclamation was both limited and revolutionary. Limited because it depended on the geography of rebellion and the reach of Union power. Revolutionary because wherever that reach extended into covered territory, the United States now claimed responsibility for upholding freedom against the very system the Confederacy sought to preserve. The document did not end the work. It assigned the work. And once the government committed itself to maintaining freedom, another question followed naturally. If Black Americans were no longer merely the subjects of a wartime policy, could they also become agents of the war that would enforce it? The proclamation answered that question too. It did not stop with recognition. It opened the door to service, to uniforms, to forts, positions, stations, and vessels, and to a new role for Black men in the armed struggle against slavery itself. That opening was not only symbolic, it was written into the machinery of the proclamation itself. After declaring that the executive government, including military and naval authorities, would recognize and maintain the freedom of those it named, Lincoln added another clause with enormous consequences. He announced that Black men of suitable condition would be received into the armed service of the United States. They could be used to garrison forts, positions, stations, and other places, and to man vessels of all sorts in that service. The language was controlled, almost administrative. It did not sound like a trumpet call. It sounded like an instruction to a government at war. But inside that instruction was a profound shift in the meaning of the conflict. The proclamation did not merely say that freedom would be recognized by federal power. It said that Black men could now become part of that power. The phrase of suitable condition belonged to the military language of the moment. It treated enlistment as a matter of service, discipline, and capacity. But the larger meaning could not be contained by that careful wording. Men who had been enslaved, men who had escaped slavery, men who had lived free but under the pressure of a slaveholding republic were now being formally admitted into the armed struggle that would decide the future of slavery itself. This mattered because the proclamation transformed Black Americans from objects of wartime policy into participants in wartime action. Earlier in the war, the public purpose of the Union effort had not been framed as emancipation everywhere. The government's first declared aim had been the preservation of the Union. By January 1st, 1863, the Final Proclamation had tied that cause to emancipation in areas still in rebellion. And by authorizing Black military service, it gave that new purpose a human form: uniforms, payrolls, drill, danger, and the right to fight under the flag of the United States. The places named in the clause were practical places: forts, positions, stations, vessels. These were not abstractions. They were the fixed points and moving instruments of war. A fort guarded a river, a harbor, a captured town, a line of supply. A position might anchor an army's control over territory. A station could become a point of occupation or support. A vessel could patrol a coast, carry men and material, or enforce Union power along waterways and sea routes. The proclamation was saying that Black service could be used wherever the war required men to hold ground, protect gains, and extend federal authority. That connection was crucial. The previous clause had promised that the United States would recognize and maintain freedom. This clause helped answer how. freedom in the proclamation was not going to be defended only by signatures and proclamations. It would be defended by armies and navies, and black men would be allowed to serve in them. The timing made the change especially powerful. The final proclamation came on January 1st, 1863. That same year, the United States colored troops began to be recruited. According to the National Park Service, the United States colored troops were first recruited in 1863 and eventually included 175 regiments. The proclamation did not by itself create every detail of that military organization, but it gave national policy a clear direction. Black enlistment was no longer a local improvisation or an uncertain experiment at the margins of the war. It was now connected to the declared policy of the commander-in-chief. The scale that followed was remarkable. By the end of the Civil War, according to the National Archives, almost 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union and for freedom. That number is not just a statistic. It marks one of the most important consequences of the proclamation. A document that had been legally limited in where it applied helped open the way for a military force drawn from the very people whose future was at stake. The African American Civil War Memorial gives another way of seeing that scale. Its stainless steel panels identify 209,145 United States colored troops who responded to the Union call to arms. Names and numbers together make the point more forcefully than policy language can. The war was not only being fought over black freedom. Increasingly, it was being fought by black men who put their own lives into the outcome. That service changed the war's moral balance. The Confederacy depended on slavery not only as a social order, but as a labor system that supported its war effort. Enslaved labor sustained farms, fortifications, supply networks, and the larger economy behind Confederate armies. When black men entered United States service, they did more than add manpower to the Union. They struck at the assumptions that slavery required. The same people whom the slave system tried to define as property became soldiers and sailors in the force moving against it. This was one reason the proclamation was more than a declaration of intent. It altered the resources available to the Union. It also altered the political meaning of Union victory. Every black soldier in federal service made it harder to imagine the war ending with slavery simply restored to its old place. Their service embodied a claim that the preservation of the Union and the destruction of slavery were now bound together. The wording of the proclamation was careful because Lincoln was still acting within a wartime framework. He grounded the order in his authority as commander-in-chief during an armed rebellion. He was not claiming, in this document, to abolish slavery throughout the entire United States. He was acting against areas designated as being in rebellion, and he was doing so as a military measure. But the enlistment clause shows how far a military measure could reach. The government was not only taking labor away from the Confederacy, it was adding that strength to the Union. There was also a change in agency. Before the proclamation, enslaved people had already been shaping the war by escaping, seeking Union lines, and forcing federal authorities to confront the question of slavery wherever armies moved. The proclamation did not invent that movement, but it gave the federal government a new official posture toward it. Black freedom was to be recognized and maintained, and black men of suitable condition could be received into armed service. What had begun as pressure from the ground now met a policy from the top. The result was not instant equality, and it did not erase the limitations of the proclamation. The document still had boundaries. It still exempted loyal border states and certain areas already under Union control. It still depended on the advance of federal power into places where the Confederacy continued to resist. But within those limits, it opened a path that changed the lived experience of the war. A man who reached Union authority might not only be treated as free under the proclamation's terms, he might also enter the military service of the United States. That possibility reshaped the meaning of Union lines. They could become places of refuge, but also places of recruitment. They could receive people escaping slavery, and they could turn some of those men into armed defenders of the very freedom the proclamation pledged to maintain. In this sense, the document's clauses worked together. Recognition required protection. Protection required force, and force could now include black soldiers and sailors. The words about forts, positions, stations, and vessels are easy to pass over because they sound so functional. Yet they reveal the proclamation's practical imagination. Lincoln was not writing only from moral memory. He was writing for commanders, recruiters, garrisons, and naval officers. He was writing for the day after the proclamation and the day after that, when the machinery of war would have to decide what to do with the people freedom had reached. By the war's end, the answer could be measured in regiments, in ships, in memorial panels, and in nearly 200,000 lives placed in the service of Union and emancipation. The one page of ink, though the surviving official copy would prove to be more than one page in physical form, had helped change who could fight, what they fought for, and what Union victory would have to mean. And yet even this transformation did not complete the work of freedom. The proclamation had turned a war measure into a door through which black military service entered the center of the conflict. It had made emancipation part of Union policy and black men part of Union power. But the document itself still had a physical life, a legal boundary, and an unfinished future. Its ink would survive in one official copy, marked, preserved, and transferred through institutions of the government, while the freedom it announced would still have to be enforced, expanded, and finally secured beyond the limits of wartime order. The document's life did not end when it opened the door to black service. Once the proclamation had declared freedom in designated rebellious territory, ordered the government to recognize and maintain that freedom, and authorized black men to enter United States armed service, it became more than a presidential statement. It became an object of government record, a piece of paper that had to be kept, marked, filed, and preserved. Its consequences moved with armies and sailors. Its physical form moved through offices. That physical afterlife matters because it reminds us that the phrase at the center of this episode, "one page of ink," is a dramatic shorthand, not a literal description of the surviving official document. The official government copy held today by the National Archives is not one page. It covers 5 pages. Those pages carry the weight of the order Lincoln issued on January 1st, 1863, in the city of Washington. They also carry the marks of bureaucracy, preservation, and time. The National Archives copy was originally tied together with narrow red and blue ribbons. Those ribbons were attached to the signature page by a wafered impression of the seal of the United States. The pages later received reinforcement strips and were mounted on a larger sheet of heavy paper. At some point in its official life, the Department of State marked the document in red ink as Proclamation 95. That red ink designation is a quiet detail, but it says something important. The proclamation was a turning point in the Civil War, a document remembered for its moral force and political consequence. Yet inside the government, it also became a numbered proclamation, placed into a continuing record of executive action. The same order that altered the meaning of Union victory could be handled, labeled, and stored as part of the administrative life of the Republic. There is a kind of tension in that image. A document that spoke of freedom was bound with ribbons. A proclamation made under the pressure of rebellion was impressed with the seal of the United States. A war measure that reached into Confederate-held territory became an official paper marked by the Department of State. The grandeur and the routine were not opposites. They belonged together. In the American system, even revolutionary consequences often passed through forms, signatures, seals, and files. The surviving copy's institutional journey continued long after the war. In 1936, the document was transferred from the Department of State to the National Archives. That transfer placed the official government copy within the institution charged with preserving the records of the United States government. By then, the Civil War had been over for generations. The people who first heard the proclamation read as news, warning, promise, or threat were gone or old. But the paper remained. Not every version survived. Lincoln's original handwritten copy of the Emancipation Proclamation burned in the Chicago fire of 1871. That loss has its own quiet force. The hand that drafted the words, the physical marks of Lincoln's writing, disappeared in one of the great urban disasters of the 19th century. What remained was the official signed government copy, preserved not as a private relic, but as a public record. That distinction matters. The lost handwritten copy would have brought us close to Lincoln's own act of writing. The surviving official copy brings us close to the act of governing. It is the proclamation as the United States issued it, sealed it, retained it, marked it, and eventually transferred it into national custody. Its survival is not only about paper, it is about continuity. It is about the state preserving the record of a moment when the meaning of the war changed. But the survival of the document should not tempt us to imagine that freedom itself was completed when the ink dried. The proclamation did something enormous, but it did not do everything. It did not abolish slavery throughout the entire United States. Its legal reach was shaped by wartime authority. It applied to the states and parts of states designated as being in rebellion, while loyal border states and certain Union-controlled areas were outside its immediate operation. That limit was not a footnote to the story. It was part of the proclamation's legal structure. Lincoln had acted as commander-in-chief during an armed rebellion. He described emancipation in the named areas as a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing that rebellion. That gave the order force in the context of war, but it also showed why a different instrument would be needed to make abolition national, permanent, and constitutional beyond the boundaries of wartime command. That instrument was the 13th Amendment. After the war, nationwide abolition came through constitutional amendment, not through the proclamation alone. The proclamation had transformed the conflict. It had made emancipation a Union war aim in the designated rebellious territory. It had linked military advance with the recognition and maintenance of freedom. It had opened the way for black military service on a scale that changed the Union war effort. But the final destruction of slavery as a legal institution across the United States required the 13th Amendment. Seen this way, the proclamation stands at the center of a longer process rather than at the end of one. It was a decisive turn, not the finish line. It pushed the United States government into a new relationship with slavery and freedom. It weakened the Confederacy by striking at the labor system that supported its war effort. It made foreign support for the Confederacy more difficult where anti-slavery opinion mattered. It changed what Union victory would have to mean. Yet it still required armies, politics, constitutional change, and the actions of enslaved people themselves to turn proclamation into lived reality. Nowhere does that unfinished quality appear more clearly than in Texas. Texas had been named in the Final Proclamation among the states in rebellion. On paper, the order reached there on January 1, 1863, but enforcement did not arrive evenly or immediately across the Confederacy. Freedom depended on the collapse of Confederate power, the presence of Union authority, and the ability to make the government's promise real on the ground. In Texas, that moment came late. The Smithsonian notes that freedom was announced in Galveston Bay on June 19, 1865, when Union troops arrived there. By then, more than 2 years had passed since Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation in Washington. The war's military outcome had shifted the conditions under which the promise could be enforced. But for enslaved people in Texas, the distance between a federal proclamation and actual freedom had been measured in time, uncertainty, and power. That late announcement in Galveston Bay reveals one of the central truths of emancipation. Freedom was not a single instant experienced everywhere at once. It was declared, resisted, advanced, delayed, enforced, and expanded. It moved through legal language and battlefield movement, through naval power and army occupation, through self-emancipation and public announcement. The proclamation mattered because it committed the United States government to a new direction. But commitment still had to become enforcement. So the surviving official copy at the National Archives carries more than the text of an order. Its 5 pages, ribbons, seal impression, reinforcement strips, mounting, and red ink designation as Proclamation 95 are traces of a government trying to preserve the evidence of its own turning point. The loss of Lincoln's handwritten copy in the Chicago fire reminds us how fragile paper can be. The survival of the official signed copy reminds us how durable a record can become when institutions choose to keep it. And the history that followed reminds us that documents do not free people by existing alone. They require power, interpretation, enforcement, and struggle. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln's proclamation changed the Civil War by making emancipation an official military, political, and moral objective of the Union war effort. It did not instantly end slavery everywhere. It did not reach every enslaved person at the same time. It did not replace the need for constitutional abolition, but it shifted the ground beneath the war. The 1 page of ink was in the archives, 5 pages. The freedom it announced was, in history, unfinished. Between those 2 facts lies the meaning of the proclamation. It was both limited and transformative, both a wartime order and a turning point in the nation's understanding of what the war was for. Its ink survived in a government record. Its promise moved unevenly across fields, towns, rivers, ports, and coastlines until Union power could make it real. And beyond the proclamation came the work it made unavoidable, the fight to secure freedom not as a temporary war measure, not as a military necessity alone, but as a permanent constitutional fact. That is why the surviving copy still matters. It is not only a preserved document from the Civil War, it is the record of the day the Union's cause changed, and of a freedom that had to be written, fought for, announced, and finally carried beyond the page.